Reconstruction itself refers to the policies implemented between 1863 and 1877, when the nation focused on winning the Civil War, abolishing slavery, defeating the Confederacy, and reconstructing the nation and the Constitution. American Civil War, the military conflict between the United States of America, the Union, and 11 secessionist Southern states, the Confederate States of America, the Confederacy, has caused a considerable havoc in the political economy of the South. At the end of the American Civil War, most of the factories, farms, and cities of the South had been devastated, and there was a spirit of retaliation against the southern states. Professor Palit better elucidates the situation, as there was a spirit of vendettas.
After the Civil War, there was a spirit of vendetta in the air. The North particularly thought that they had won the war against the South, and therefore they wanted to chastise the South for their indiscipline, their rebellion. And this would take various forms. They pleaded that the South should not get any compensation for land. They should not get back their land. That there should be no representation of the South into the federal government, either in the Senate or in the Congress or in the cabinet. They even suggested that the tariff wall should be made very high so that southern cotton didn't sell in the northern market or in the global market. They also suggested that money supply should be made very tight so that they would have to produce more to earn a single gold dollar. And another thing that they planned was that the northern Republicans should go to the South and become the governors of these states which had earlier seceded and then come back to the American Union. So the governors should all be made from the Republican Party of the North, and that they would also have total representation in the federal government as well. And for these reasons, they actually went over to the South to establish their control over the freed men.
After the Civil War, many Northerners, mostly young men in their 20s and 30s, who had served in the Union Army during the Civil War, moved to South to carve out a space for themselves. They were referred to as the Carpetbaggers. Explaining the reason of the Carpetbaggers being named so, Professor Palit says,
these people of the Northern Republicans were known in history as the Carpetbaggers because they carried a carpet bag with them. That's why they were called Carpetbaggers. But this was the nickname for the political opportunists of the North. But they were not only from the North. There were people, their collaborators in the South as well. There were Southern Republicans, some of them, who are known as scalawags. Scalawags also did the same thing. They joined hands with the Carpetbaggers in exploiting the illiterate freedmen of the South. And for this reason, they established what they called Freedmen's Bureau. The function of these Freedmen's Bureau is to train the recently freed black Americans in the exercise of votes. And they were even told to vote early and often. That means they tried to politically corrupt them. Actually, they were to do whatever they were bidden to do. They had to be at the beck and call of these opportunists from the North, the Carpetbaggers from the North. To back it up, the Freedmen's Bureau also had a few legislations passed in the South, which were known as Black Acts. Black Acts were actually various retrograde acts to punish the black vagrants if they do not conform to the wishes of the northern Republicans. So the spirit of vendetta was on. That is what I wanted to say. So black acts were passed which were actually to punish the truant, obstinate blacks. And apart from that, even if the black acts failed, they would have the force of Ku Klux Klan. That is, they are the rough and tough men of these people. And they would physically coerce the recalcitrant blacks into submission. That's the worst part of it. In this way, some kind of a Republican regime was established over the South soon after the Civil War.
So then what was the economic condition of the South during that time?
It's a good question. I had been given the political scenario so far, but the economic condition was also desperate at this point. And we see that, really speaking, the erstwhile flourishing cotton economy of the South had been shattered because of the Civil War. Cotton was no longer the king, not only in the world, not only in the North, not even in the South. It did not really become the money spinner it used to be. So that was a very sad situation. And many of these people had lost their land, and the northern Republicans would not allow them to regain their land for cultivation. So that was also economically very desperate. And on top of that, money supply was kept very tight, and it was based on gold standard. And the black people, though they were freed, they had no way of earning this money by hard labor, because jobs were not available in the South at that time. Whatever jobs had been created, they were all in the North, because the North was fast industrializing. Factories were being opened, mills were being opened there. South was basically a plantation economy. Therefore, once the plantations were destroyed due to war, they had lost their jobs, they have lost their lands, and then they're taking their trek to the North. So we can say that the economy of the South was desperate, and the people were unhinged from the previous economic security.
Such vindictive measures adopted against the Southerners left them truly desperate and entirely at the mercy of the Northerners. It took another sage-like president, Andrew Johnson, to better the situation and to renew the feeling of oneness in the American Union. President Abraham Lincoln was the major policy maker until his assassination in April 1865. He initiated the process of Reconstruction in most of the state as soon as federal troops took control of them. But the process stalled less than a week after the South surrendered. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in April 1865. After the demise of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson succeeded him as president. The Reconstruction measure adopted by Andrew Johnson was a noble attempt to rehabilitate both the Southern polity and its economy. Dr. Chittavrata Palit, in his lecture discussion, describes President Johnson as a very sage politician.
And fortunately speaking, there was a very sage politician from among the Republicans who became the next president. Soon after Lincoln was murdered, temporary presidency of Grant was also over. By regular election, Andrew Johnson became the new president. I have called him a very sage politician in the sense that he had not that kind of a mood of vendetta. He was a practical politician. So he tried his best to heal the wounds and to get back these seceded states into the American Union, and also to consolidate American economy, both North and South, together as a national economy.
So, sir, was Andrew Johnson's policy social or political?
Well, this is a very searching question. If you ask me like that, I would say that initially it was political, no doubt about that. So there are many authors who had said that It was more a political reconstruction during Johnson's period rather than social rehabilitation. But so far as I can see it, we see that Andrew Johnson tried both. Political reconstruction was there to give these people franchise. The black people should get this franchise, they should cast their vote properly, and they should be able to get their own representatives in the southern states and finally also in the National Congress and the Senate. So he had that kind of attitude, no doubt. But at the same time, he felt that unless southern economy was regenerated, North couldn't provide all these freedmen with jobs, with other kinds of work and housing and other facilities. It would not be possible for the North entirely to take the burden of the blacks from the South. So South also had to regenerate its economy, and we find that Andrew Johnson was trying his best to do that. So he was combining both the political reconstruction, giving political rights to the freedmen, right of vote, suffrage, and his participation in the government, that was there. At the same time, he also tried social rehabilitation. I hope that that satisfies your question. I carry on the story from this point. Further, I would say that a time came when all these bickerings between the South and the North, between the Republicans and Democrats, gradually faded out. And we see that Andrew Johnson, finally, when he was leaving, he created a climate through which a real compromise could come. And that was visible when the next election came in 1868. The northern candidate was Hayes and the southern candidate was Tilden. It was to be a fight between Tilden and Hayes. Tilden was representing solid South with a southern agenda of rehabilitation, of political opportunity. And the northern Republican leader, Hayes, he had a northern agenda, no doubt, that there should be free economy, free people, industry, and urbanization and all that. That program was there. At the same time, Hayes wanted to reconcile the South very much.
Rutherford B. Hayes, who became the 19th President of America, ran for presidency at a critical time. It was the Reconstruction era, and Hayes actually transformed his entire campaign as a fight for Reconstruction. There he came out with a big liberal package.
In this package, there are a lot of incentives given to the South. And we find that, first of all, land was restored to them. Literally, land was restored to them, and agriculture once again would become buoyant in the South. Part of plantation economy was revived. That was there, that's the one. Secondly, tariff was scaled down so that southern goods could sell in the world market. Particularly cotton could sell in the world market. So that was done. Money was made cheaper once again. Silver coins were allowed into the market. So the strict gold standard was no longer there. This was there. And then politically also, there could be southern Democrats as governors of the southern states. They could also come into the Senate and Congress in the federal government through black votes, black constituencies. What was the corruption of the earlier days of Freedmen's Bureau? These were now reduced, and genuine representation of the black people into the Senate and into the Congress was possible. And Hayes even went to the extent of allowing one Southern Democrat, or he had to be a Republican or a follower of the Republican principle, as a cabinet secretary. So up to these concessions were given. When these concessions were given, naturally tension was over. That vendetta was completely over. A perfect reconciliation was possible. And we see that Tilden bowed down before Hayes, and Hayes won the election by a huge margin. So the Republicans became president once again. It was a Republican regime. Nevertheless, South had been properly accommodated, assimilated into the national framework. So that's how the problem was by and large solved. The first pair of historians who had raised some controversy were R.G. Randall, who is the authoritative historian of the Reconstruction. His famous book, Civil War and Reconstruction, is well known. And there he says that the Reconstruction program was insincere, that it was mostly political reconstruction. They bothered too much about political rehabilitation rather than social and economic. That was his contention. And he had criticized the malpractices in the elections, manipulation of the black votes by slogans like vote early and often, etc., etc. So that was there. And therefore he has criticized the Reconstruction program very much. But on the other hand, we have Coulter, who had also written a very good book on Southern Reconstruction. Coulter says, no, it was not really a blackout of honest government, blackout of social justice. It was not like that. Many of the southern states, which actually had a northern Republican as governor, but many of the blacks as representatives in the state legislature, they passed many good legislations in favor of the blacks. And there is a whole agenda of social reform in the state legislatures. Particularly, he has cited the case of South Carolina, where night schools were opened by legislation. Adult education and children's education was provided. Women's emancipation was talked about. The loans were remitted. Then further land was back to the tiller in many cases.
Sir, then what is your opinion with regard to this argument?
Well, from an Indian perspective, reading critically both the versions of Randall and Coulter, I have come to the conclusion that truth lies in between them. It was not really speaking a blackout of honest government. After all, it's a very critical time. There's the best of times and at the same time worst of times. So because of that, there was a lot of wavering, no doubt. But something definitely was achieved. There was at least a political framework laid down through which the blacks could record their voice. That was achieved. On the other hand, socially and economically, we find that a lot of valuable legislations are made for their social rehabilitation. So, abuses were there. We cannot rule out the abuses. Political opportunism was there, and we have already talked about the Ku Klux Klan, who had actually physically assaulted many blacks, and the black codes where they were discriminated against, as in apartheid. So that things were done. They couldn't go to the white school, to white hospital, and all these white clubs. These things were there. So the black side is there, the white side is also there. In between the two, I would say that Coulter is partially right. Randall, when he talks about the abuses, he's also right. So one has to balance these two opinions and write one's own text. Controversy is between two very famous historians. One is Dwight Dumont. Dwight Dumont is a Marxist, and Dumont says that though these people were freed, the political freedom was given and economically they were freed, they migrated to north. Once they came to north, it was not a paradise for them. They thought that it was going to be their paradise, but they ultimately entered into slums, into ghettos, got the lowest ranks of jobs. Mainly they sold themselves as cheap labor. So he argues that once a slave, always a slave. So their condition, whether free or slave, was more or less the same. coming to North was really not a boon to them. And this had to slog for this kind of labor-intensive jobs for a long time. They remained the pariah within quotes. So that was the thing. But this argument of Dumont has not been accepted by the other notable historian, Gutman. Gutman has also written on this rehabilitation of the blacks in the North on that subject. And Gutman says, no, it was not such a bleak picture. North was not so hostile to the blacks. The whites were not so hostile to the blacks. Because this was the period of industrial revolution and big business. They needed a lot of cheap labor. And therefore, these black laborers were very much welcome, who could really put in hard work. And therefore, they were welcome and they were given a lot of social security measures for proper rehabilitation.
So, sir, in this context, what do you think? Wherein lies the truth?
I would say, once again, the truth lies in between the two. In between the two. And the blacks are to blame themselves also. But the white people, they basically remain, we can say the upper crust. And they continue to look down upon the blacks, maybe due to color, due to race. That is a factor. The racism is rampant. Not only with the blacks, even with other browns in the country. Finally, I would sum up by saying that I have my personal Indian perspective on this question, and that is, it was neither a paradise regained nor a paradise lost. The situation was somewhere in the middle, and there were some gains, more losses, and racism prevailed, and this what we call the marginalization of the blacks continues, and only recently, because a black president from the South, Barack Obama, has come to the White House, situation has considerably improved. I think as the world progresses, there's more of globalization, more of economic meltdown. I think the color bar or other things will also melt down, and so society will be more democratic and more humanitarian.
In this episode, our discussion on Reconstruction started with the Civil War, which has caused a considerable havoc in the political economy of the South. In the second phase, we discussed freedmen politics. Many young Northerners who had served in the Union Army during the Civil War, they were referred to as Carpetbaggers. Together with the Scalawags, they established Freedmen's Bureau to train the recently freed black Americans. Freedmen's Bureau also passed a few legislations known as the Black Acts to punish the black vagrants. Even if the Black Acts failed, they would have the rough and tough men force known as Ku Klux Klan. Then we discussed the economic condition in the South. There we understand that the economy of South was desperate and the people were unhinged from the previous economic security. Thereafter, we discussed the reconciliation program of Andrew Johnson. First, there was political reconciliation, and then there was socio-economic reconciliation, and came to know about the different packages given by Andrew Johnson. We also learnt about the upcoming president, that is Hayes, who also offered a full package so that there could be some kind of reconciliation. Next, we discussed how far these reconciliation programs were genuine and their outcome. And then we indulged in the debates among historians. The first debate is between R.D. Randall and Coulter. Randall says that it was mainly a political reconstruction, but in Coulter's opinion, there was considerable rehabilitation on socio-economic field. The second famous debate is between Dwight Drummond, the Marxist historian, and Gutman. They debate the fate of the freedmen. How good was their rehabilitation? On that question, Drummond says that these people were miserable. Once a slave, always a slave. So their condition did not improve much. Against that, Gutman, of course, says that the situation was not that bleak. The first batch of blacks who had come to North got good asylum. They set up the household very well, and the future batches got accommodation among these people.